Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Before there was a god emperor, before the golden throne was carved from myth and madness, there was Terra. Broken, bloodied, yet ruled. This truth lies buried beneath a mountain of imperial propaganda, a corpse-veiled history denied to all but the most heretical minds. The Imperium wants you to believe there was only darkness, and then the emperor rose, as inevitable as the dawn. But what if the night had its own kings? What if the ashes upon which the Imperium was built once held a crown, tarnished and ancient, lost to the flames of conquest? Some whisper of this final sovereign, the last who dared to call Terra his own before the Emperor emerged with thunder in his voice and angels at his side. A monarch? A tyrant? A sorcerer? Or merely a figurehead drowned in a world gone mad? No one knows for sure, but in the cracks of forgotten lore, in the smudged ink of redacted texts, and the haunted memories of dying thunder warriors, a question lingers. Who ruled Terra when no one was meant to? The Age of Strife was not simply an era of chaos. It was a crucible of apocalypse. To understand who may have ruled Terra before the Emperor, we must first gaze unflinchingly into this abyss, into the 1,000 years when mankind devoured itself. Terra, once the seat of the greatest civilization in human history, had become a decaying carcass choked by its own legacy. The very skies burned with warp storms, severing communication and travel between the stars. The interstellar empire humanity had built collapsed inward, its planets left to fend for themselves in a galaxy turned feral. And at the heart of this unraveling, Earth, Holy Terra, was consumed by madness. What the Age of Strife did to Terra cannot be overstated. Cities that once sang with post-scarcity opulence turned into battlefields of starvation, disease, and ceaseless civil war. Oceans boiled. Continents fractured not just physically, but politically, spiritually, and ideologically. Ancient gene vaults were raided, and nightmare creations of biotechnological ambition, things with the minds of men and the forms of monsters, roamed free. The Mechanicum lost contact with Mars, and the noble houses of Terra collapsed under the weight of psychic terror as the first uncontrolled psychers, untutored, unstable, and possessed, began to manifest in droves. It was not an apocalypse that came suddenly. It was a slow, centuries-long suffocation. Civilization was not merely shattered. It was replaced. In the ruins rose the techno-barbarians, warlords who ruled with a blend of salvage technology, religious fanaticism, and sheer violence. They crafted new cultures in the image of what they could remember or imagine, fusing ancient myths with misunderstood science. Plasma rifles were wielded like sacred relics. Data scrolls were read as scripture. The concept of a global government became laughable. There were no nations anymore, only fiefdoms, clans, fortress states, and wandering tribes. Out of this fragmented world came horrors both vast and petty. Mutant cults offered sacrifices to gods they couldn't name. AI war machines, long ago unshackled and then abandoned, continued their bloody patrols, hunting anything that moved. Cities sank into the earth, and orbital platforms fell from the sky like flaming omens. The psychic backlash was constant. Mass possessions, warp storms that touched down like lightning, entire populations driven insane overnight by unseen whispers. The concept of history dissolved into legend. Literacy vanished outside the priesthoods of the techno-sorcerers. Knowledge became power, and power was hoarded like food in a famine. Yet even within the nightmare, there was a kind of order, a grim rhythm to survival. Some regions of Terra stabilized under strong warlords or coalitions of noble clans. The Pan-Pacific Empire on the ruins of the Old East rose to technological prominence, wielding biomechanical weapons and genetic manipulation. The domains of Ursh held vast swaths of land under an iron cult of sorcery and psychic might. Each of these powers believed itself sovereign. Each had a capital, a court, a mythology. Some claimed to be heirs of old Earth. Others rewrote history entirely, declaring themselves divinely chosen by the machine gods, the sky kings, or even forgotten celestial dragons. But perhaps most importantly, these were not isolated tyrannies. They warred, they negotiated, they traded, however primitively, and they recognized one another. There was, in a twisted sense, an international system among them. Kings, queens, emperors, overlords, and god priests all vied for dominance. Some even began to envision the idea of uniting Terra under one banner again, dreaming of a second great age, forged through fire. The names of their leaders have mostly been lost, but fragments remain. Caligon of Ursh, the cyber lords of the Pan-Pacific, the Ivory Empress of Antarctica. They were not myths in their time. They were real, and they ruled. It is within this nightmarish arena of competing powers that we must ask, could there have been a singular dominant power before the Emperor made himself known? A last sovereign who held the greatest claim to Terra? Not in name alone, but in substance. A ruler with infrastructure, armies, territory, and a legacy that challenged the very idea of the Emperor's destiny. The Age of Strife did not just produce monsters, it produced monarchs. The reason we know so little of this period is not merely the passage of time. The Imperium made a concerted effort to erase it. When the unification began, history was rewritten. Archives were purged, monuments destroyed. If there was a final king of Terra, his story would have been the first to burn. Because to acknowledge a throne before the Golden One is to question the Emperor's myth, that he alone rose when no other could, that he saved humanity from itself, not conquered it like any other warlord. So the Age of Strife is not merely a backdrop. It is the smokescreen behind which the truth hides. Within its horror lived the last lights of ancient kingship, flickering in defiance of the coming dawn. Whether mad or noble, tyrant or visionary, someone ruled Terra before the Emperor declared it his. And that someone may have worn a crown that has never been named, resting now beneath 10,000 years of ash. To speak of Terra before the Emperor is to conjure images of a world not merely fractured but kaleidoscopically divided, each shard reflecting a different dream or nightmare of sovereignty. In the abyss left by the collapse of the old Earth's unified governance, power became a local phenomenon. And like rot spreading from a central wound, kingdoms, baronies, theocracies, and city-states sprouted from the broken flesh of the planet. These were the fragmented kingships, a tapestry of dominions ruled by techno-barbarians, god-kings, warlords, and self-declared emperors, each more grotesque or majestic than the last. These rulers didn't inherit civilization. They built their thrones on its bones. They had no shared lineage or banner, no Terran identity beyond the soil under their boots. Instead, they reinvented history to serve their rule. One might proclaim descent from solar royalty, another claimed to be the reincarnation of a Martian saint. Their power came not from consensus or laws, but from the ability to kill, dominate, or awe. Some wielded lost technologies like totems of divine right, grav weapons, AI relics, genetically engineered monsters. Others relied on pure human charisma, or terror, or the manipulation of the desperate masses through religion. In the Himalayan basin, ancient fortress cities became the cradles of highland priest kings who worshipped the stars as living gods. They used forbidden warp rituals and enslaved psychers to perform miracles. In the sub-Saharan ruins of what had once been techno-scientific hubs, warlords rode in solar-powered chariots, wearing armor forged from the exoskeletons of extinct Xenos. To the far north, frozen citadels housed artificial intelligence cults who crowned machine prophets as their rulers, whispering data stream prayers into the cold night air. And deep beneath the poisoned oceans, domed kingdoms survived in isolation, ruled by hermetic dynasties that treated surface dwellers as mythological creatures. There were no borders in the traditional sense, only influence zones marked by craters, collapsed transport lines, or the range of a warlord's artillery. Ambassadors were unheard of. Spies and assassins were the only diplomatic currency. Trade, when it existed, was brutal and pragmatic. Biotoxins for food, slaves for electricity, weaponry for hallucinogenic fungi that could suppress psychic fits. Alliances were forged in blood and shattered within a generation. And yet, in the twisted logic of these kingships, there was stability of a kind. Each dominion had its own rituals, its own understanding of what it meant to rule. In the steppes of the eastern wastes, matrilineal warrior clans forged iron banners and held council under storm-blasted spires, swearing oaths that lasted centuries. In the emerald sinkholes of the equatorial jungles, the cult of the Black Vine ruled through a symbiotic union of man and mutated flora, their monarch known only as the Bloomfather. Even the most grotesque of these regimes had structure. Their populations endured, some even thrived, by the standards of the time. One cannot overlook the spiritual nature of this kingship. Religion was inseparable from governance. Every ruler, whether cybernetic warlord or plague-ridden messiah, cloaked themselves in myth. Some claimed to speak with ancient gods trapped in orbiting derelicts. Others promised ascension through genetic purity, preaching doctrines of blood and machine. To be king in this world was to be more than human. It was to be myth incarnate, the axis around which a cult, a people, a war machine spun. These kings and queens did not see themselves as temporary powers. They built monuments, named eras after themselves, passed down crowns. They minted currency, sometimes digital, sometimes literal bone tokens. They commissioned epics, painted murals, created symbols that echoed the forgotten heraldry of Earth's golden age. Their hubris was immense because they ruled without challenge from beyond the stars. Mankind was alone, and in that solitude, the tyrants bloomed. And yet, they were all pretenders, even if they did not know it. Their rule was local, parochial, doomed. Beyond the radioactive haze and collapsing infrastructure, something stirred. A force long hidden was preparing to make itself known. But for a moment, perhaps even a few centuries, these fragmented kingships believed they were the future. They believed they were rebuilding what was lost. In truth, they were only paving the way for a war they could not imagine, a reckoning they could not withstand. What is most haunting is that some of these realms may have lasted longer than the average imperial world survives today. They may have had deeper traditions, tighter community bonds, and a more visceral understanding of survival. But in the eyes of the Imperium, they were cancerous growths to be cut away. Their stories, their cultures, even their languages, purged. Yet, in the cracks of forgotten ruins and the minds of those who remember, the echoes persist. These were the last true nations of Earth before it became a throne world. Their kings ruled not galaxies, but hearts and soil, and that, in the end, made them dangerous. The tale of the Unification Wars is typically told in the language of triumph, a narrative where the Emperor, bathed in divine inevitability, descends upon a sundered Earth and, through the sheer weight of his genius and might, brings unity to a world choking on its own madness. But that story, as canonized by imperial historians, is one of myth-making. It smooths over the jagged truths, the contested victories, and most crucially, it buries the possibility that Terra was not a void waiting to be filled, but a world already ruled by powers strong enough to rival the coming storm. The truth is, the Unification Wars were not a conquest of disorder, they were a civil war of forgotten empires. Some of these powers were not mere squabbling warbands. They were sophisticated, culturally rich, and ideologically complex societies that had emerged from the apocalypse of the Age of Strife with iron in their spines. They didn't see the Emperor as a savior. They saw him as a threat, an alien ideology wrapped in the flesh of a man. To them, he was the usurper. And so, they fought, not as raiders or rebels, but as kingdoms defending their right to exist. This isn't to say the Emperor's vision was without merit. Far from it. His dream of unity, of a humanity raised above its petty squabbles and set on a path toward galactic destiny, was powerful. But dreams, even righteous ones, must contend with the reality of those already dreaming. These kingdoms, with their ancient lineages and twisted faiths, were not merely obstacles, they were rivals. And it is within that rivalry that the idea of a last king takes shape. Not just a leader resisting fate, but perhaps a sovereign whose power was nearly equal to the one who would become a god. Imagine the Unification Wars not as a sweeping march of liberation, but as a brutal, decade-spanning campaign where every kilometer of scorched earth had to be bled for. Where the Emperor's gene-forged thunder warriors faced foes who wielded technologies just as advanced, if not older, and far more reckless. Where alliances rose and collapsed like burning spires. In this chaos, certain empires did not merely fall, they shattered the myth of the Emperor's inevitability. For a moment, they forced even him to reckon with the cost of conquest. This raises a profound and haunting question. Could there have been a point where one of these rulers, a king, an empress, a technocrat, stood on equal footing with the Emperor? Could a different future have been carved, had fate leaned a fraction to the side? And if so, who was this rival, this echo of a vanished throne? Theories abound. Some believe it was Caligon of Ursh, a figure of immense mystique and power, often portrayed as the ultimate antagonist of unification. Others point to the Pan-Pacific warlords, whose biomechanical dominion may have held more land and more firepower than any other power on Terra at the time. But there are whispers of others, of a hidden regency buried beneath the ice of Antarctica, of a psychic dynasty in the western steppes whose rulers never aged, of a techno-theocracy in orbit that rained fire down upon Terra before disappearing without a trace. All these stories suggest that unification was not an act of divine right, but of strategic domination. The Emperor may have had a longer vision, a nobler goal, but he won through war. And where there is war, there is always a victor and a vanquished. The myth that the Emperor emerged from nowhere and simply imposed order is a convenient lie, one that erases the identities of those he defeated. The victors in history write the records, and the Imperium has long had a vested interest in ensuring that the Emperor appears as the sole sun in the sky, not one among many stars extinguished. But these extinguished stars once shone. Their palaces may now be buried beneath the imperial palace, their banners burned, their names forbidden. But they ruled. Their laws, however brutal or enlightened, governed millions. Their armies held the line against chaos, Xenos, and their own inner demons. And when the Emperor came, they did not kneel. They fought. This reframing of the unification wars doesn't diminish the Emperor. If anything, it makes his achievement more monumental. He didn't bring light to darkness. He outshone 100 flames and made theirs irrelevant. He didn't unite a world of savages. He overthrew kings, and in doing so, he made himself the only name that mattered. The unification, then, was not the first chapter of history. It was a purge, a memory wiped clean so that only one dream would remain. But in the cracks of that dream, a question lingers. Who was the last to believe they ruled Terra before the eagle's shadow fell? Who sat upon a throne knowing that the end was coming, not from below, but from above? That unnamed sovereign, that final rival, may never have their names spoken again, but their silence is the price of the Emperor's voice, and their death was the final act of an old world burning to make way for a god. Ursh. The name still echoes like a curse across the bones of old Terra. It is not a word spoken lightly, even now. Among those who study the distant, blood-blackened history of humanity's cradle, Ursh is a wound, raw, infected, and deliberately left to fester in myth. It was not merely a kingdom, it was an empire in every sense, vast, ancient, and self-contained. A self-perpetuating war machine that believed, with terrifying conviction, that it should be the rightful ruler of the world. In the twilight of the Age of Strife, Ursh was more than a power. It was an ideology, a belief in human supremacy taken to its most corrupted, nihilistic extreme. While other kingdoms collapsed into barbarism or technology worship, Ursh adapted. It consumed. It tore through the remnants of pre-strife science and fused them with psychic domination and occult sorcery. Its armies weren't just soldiers, they were indoctrinated cults, psychic shock troops, daemon-bound monstrosities, and chemically enhanced berserkers. Ursh understood the value of fear. Its banners were blackened suns, its victories were etched into the flesh of its captives. The center of Ursh's dominion was believed to have stretched across the northern continent, swallowing what had once been Eurasia. From the irradiated coasts of the Atlantic to the bitter wastes of Siberia, it held its grip through a mixture of overwhelming psychic suppression, technological supremacy, and old-world remnants twisted to serve its cause. It was not a place of joy, but it was efficient. People obeyed, or they vanished. Cities were rebuilt in the image of dominion. Vast concrete monoliths with speaker towers that pulsed thought control frequencies, air saturated with chemical loyalty enhancers, children bred in nutrient tanks to become soldiers before they could speak. Yet the horror of Ursh was never in its infrastructure. It was in its crown, in the figure who wore it. Caligan. No name inspires more fear, more awe, more speculative dread in the forbidden texts of Terran pre-imperial studies than Caligan of Ursh. Sorcerer. King, tyrant, god. The stories disagree on everything except one fact. Caligan was the apex predator of mankind before the Emperor revealed himself. Some say he was immortal, a psyker of unimaginable potency who never aged and could burn thoughts into reality with a whisper. Others suggest he was merely the latest in a line of cloned rulers, each genetically perfected and psychically imprinted with the will of the original. A dynasty in one body. Caligan did not hide in bunkers. He rode at the front of his war hosts on a throne of bone carried by cybernetic slaves. He debated rival kings in their own courts before beheading them and absorbing their territories. He turned captured psychers into living engines of prophecy, forcing them to scream visions into the minds of his generals. It is said that Ursh's greatest weapon was the Black Cyclops, a weaponized piece of archaeotech rumored to be a fragment of a shattered AI god, through which Caligan could see the future and twist the fabric of time in small, cruel increments. His dominion clashed with the emperors at the height of the Unification Wars. Where others fell quickly, drowned in thunder and blood, Ursh endured. Its cities did not crumble at first. Its legions pushed back the Thunder Warriors with a tenacity that stunned even the most zealous of imperial warlords. The battles between Ursh and the Emperor were cataclysms, not mere wars. Mountains cracked, storms broke through the warp, and hovered like angry gods over battlefields. Entire regiments of Thunder Warriors were annihilated in the fields of Panrak, their bodies reduced to ash in memory. Caligan stood against the tide and spat in the face of destiny. But the Emperor is not merely a warlord. He is inevitability wearing flesh. Eventually, even Caligan had to fall. The final battle, if it can be believed, was not just a clash of armies but of wills. It is said the Emperor confronted Caligan directly atop the ruins of the Pale Citadel in a psychic duel that cracked the sky and silenced the minds of those who watched. What passed between them is lost to time. Some say Caligan begged, others say he laughed as he died. The Emperor took his skull, they claim, and placed it in a vault so secret that only one being has seen it since. And yet, the legacy of Ursh lingers. It whispers from the shadows of the Imperial Palace, in the construction techniques that mirror Urshan architecture, in the prison libraries where redacted texts speak of empires built not by chaos, but by terrifying human will. Caligan, for all his cruelty, was a reflection, a distorted mirror held up to the Emperor. Both sought to unify Terra, both wielded powers beyond comprehension, but only one would be allowed to write history. Was Caligan the last king before the Emperor? Perhaps. If anyone wore a crown in defiance of the rising sun, it was him. But he was more than a king. He was the final argument against unity through peace. He believed that control, absolute and unflinching, was the only way forward, that mankind needed to be broken before it could be saved. In the end, Ursh was not simply defeated. It was annihilated, purged from record, from memory, from maps. The last embers of its defiance snuffed out by an Imperium that could not risk remembering. But sometimes in the dead of night, when Terran winds howl through the ruins of forbidden vaults, the name returns. Ursh, Caligan, the last king, the first warning. Caligan's shadow loomed so large that it almost eclipsed the other rising stars of Terra's long, blood-slicked dusk. But to imagine he alone bore the weight of pre-imperial sovereignty would be to ignore one of the most disturbing and ambitious regimes ever to crawl from the ashes of Earth's ruin, the Pan-Pacific Empire. Where Ursh was a kingdom of flame and sorcery, the Pan-Pacific was a hive of steel and circuits, an empire built not on myth, but on cold, mechanical ideology. If Caligan was a dark mirror of the Emperor's psychic dominion, the Pan-Pacific was a cruel echo of his technological mastery. Located across what had once been East and Southeast Asia, stretching deep into the radioactive wastes of the Pacific Basin, the Pan-Pacific Empire thrived in places other kingdoms feared to tread. It was a dominion of drowned cities and mountain bunkers, deep ocean arcologies and sky-shrouded machine spires. The apocalypse had scoured the region of breathable air and drinkable water. Yet the Pan-Pacific lords endured. They built sealed cities powered by geothermal reactors and orbital solar arrays, their people reduced to cogs in vast technocratic engines. They were not a people in the traditional sense. They were a process. The rulers of the Pan-Pacific Empire were not kings in the romantic sense. They did not wear crowns or speak to their people from marble thrones. They were the cybernetic tyrants, a rotating oligarchy of enhanced overlords whose minds were fused with data streams, war algorithms, and inherited machine consciousnesses dating back to the dark age of technology. Each tyrant was selected not by bloodline or charisma, but by computational merit, chosen through contests of neural acuity and predictive warfare simulations. Once selected, their flesh was stripped, their nerves wired into machine frames, and their identities overwritten with layers of past tyrants' memories. They were not individuals, they were iterations. What made the Pan-Pacific Empire terrifying was not its cruelty, which was immense, but its competence. It was a civilization that functioned. Rigid, pitiless, but functional. Cities were organized into caste complexes, each governed by subroutines derived from AI fragments salvaged from ancient data vaults. Children were grown in creches and assigned occupational roles based on genetic analysis and psychological profiling. Psychers, if born, were either lobotomized and turned into psychic batteries, or subjected to surgical containment procedures that made the Emperor's own early laboratories look quaint by comparison. Crime was virtually non-existent, not because it was rare, but because it was predicted and eliminated before it occurred. The Empire's military was equally horrifying. Unlike the berserkers of Ursh or the tribal warbands of the Western techno-barbarian states, the Pan-Pacific Army operated like a living circuit. Soldiers were implanted with neural relay chips that allowed them to act as one, a single, continent-spanning mind. Their armor was sealed exorigs reinforced with artificial musculature and magnetic shielding. They used drone swarms, gravitational inversion bombs, and zero-point edge weaponry. Their doctrine prioritized annihilation over victory. A battlefield with no survivors was preferable to one with prisoners. When the Emperor's forces reached the borders of the Pan-Pacific Empire, they did not find chaos. They found resistance so methodical it bordered on beautiful. The Thunder Warriors, bred for destruction, found themselves slowed, predicted, and flanked before they had even landed. Initial campaigns ended in catastrophic losses. The tyrants had prepared for every kind of assault except one, the Emperor himself. When he entered the war, he did not merely attack. He infiltrated, subverted, turned the Empire's own logic against it. It is said he inserted coded subroutines into the Pan-Pacific network, disguised as divine mathematical truths. He corrupted their algorithms not with viruses but with paradox. Their most advanced prediction engines began to dream, and in those dreams, they saw only a golden figure standing in fire. The Emperor's psychic presence seeped into the grid. Tyrants experienced visions. Some went mad. Others tried to adapt to incorporate the Emperor into their logic models, only to be unraveled from within. In the end, the Pan-Pacific Empire did not fall to siege. It collapsed inward. Its neural unity turned to discord. Its soldiers lost coherence. The cities did not burn. They simply shut down. Lights dimmed. Doors stopped opening. Citizens, stripped of instruction, sat in place and starved, awaiting orders that never came. The Emperor walked into the heart of the Empire without resistance, not because he had won, but because he had made them surrender to the absurdity of a god they could neither quantify nor destroy. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, were the cybernetic tyrants any less divine than the being who conquered them? Their empire endured longer than most modern imperial worlds survive. Their systems, their logic, their control. It was terrifying, but it was real. They ruled not with charisma or tradition, but with purpose. In a universe of superstition and decay, that clarity is rare, perhaps too rare to be allowed to live. The Pan-Pacific Empire may not have had a singular king, but it ruled vast portions of Terra with such unyielding efficiency that its collective will could be seen as a throne all its own. It was a throne without gold, without blood, without soul. And maybe that is why it had to be broken. The Emperor did not simply defeat an enemy, he erased a possibility, a version of humanity that could survive without him. That, more than any battlefield, was the true war. And in that war, a nameless king machine may have stood, however briefly, as the last rival monarch of Terra, and in silence perished. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's firstborn blades, not sons but weapons, carved in fury and tempered in desperation. Their story is not one of glory, but of necessary brutality. For if the last kings of Terra were to be broken, it would not be done with diplomacy or distant fire. It would be done with these giants, forged from gene laboratories that stank of ozone and burnt flesh, wielding weapons too crude for elegance and too final for mercy. The Thunder Warriors were the executioners of a forgotten age, the shadows that heralded the Emperor's dawn. They were not like the Astartes. They were never meant to be. Crude, unstable, monstrous, but devastatingly effective. Their bodies were hulking masses of muscle and reinforced bone, riddled with augmentations and metabolic accelerants. They aged rapidly, burned brightly, and died horrifically. Their minds, often racked by pain and fury, were engineered for loyalty through control, not enlightenment. But for the Emperor's purposes, they were perfect. Because the enemies they faced, the last kings of Terra, could not be defeated by idealism. They could only be drowned in blood. When the Unification Wars began in earnest, the Thunder Warriors were the spearhead. Not negotiators, not peacekeepers, but harbingers of extinction. Each deployment was a cataclysm. Cities leveled in hours, armies routed by sheer shock and awe. They were not precise. They did not take prisoners. The Emperor did not ask them to. These warriors were unleashed upon the fragmented kingdoms with the singular purpose of ending them. And end them they did. The king of the glacial throne was dragged from his cryovault and torn in half. The sky priests of the Black Singularity were crucified on their own orbital elevators. The Bloomfather of the equatorial vine cults, who had ruled for over 2 centuries through a symbiosis with sentient plant matter, was incinerated alongside his living temples. The Thunder Warriors did not just win battles, they unmade regimes. With each broken palace and silenced dynasty, Terra lost another piece of its old soul. Some kingdoms fought with honor, others with madness. But none, in the end, could hold back the tide. The Thunder Warriors came like nightmares made flesh. Their armor, though primitive compared to the later designs of the Astartes, was terrifying in its brutality. Slabs of ceramite reinforced with scavenged tech, adorned with trophies of conquered lords. Their weapons were massive, often unreliable, and devastating. Plasma guns that vented backwash into the user's face. Chain blades so massive they shattered bone on sheer impact. They did not fear death because they did not expect to survive. And yet, in this hurricane of destruction, something deeply tragic simmered beneath the surface. The Thunder Warriors were tools, yes. But they were also men. Men who bled, who suffered, who sometimes questioned. They watched as the old world was erased. Some saw beauty in what they destroyed. Murals, philosophies, ways of life that had endured the strife. Some began to wonder if they were the monsters, not the kings they slew. But questioning had no place in their design. Those who wavered were reconditioned. Those who faltered were sent on suicide missions. The Emperor could not afford sentiment. The old world had to be obliterated completely. Not simply defeated. Because any survivor, any remnant of a former king's legacy, would cast doubt on the purity of the new order. The Thunder Warriors were not merely soldiers of conquest. They were the ritual fire through which Terra was purified. In time, their very success made them obsolete. When the last kings had fallen, and the dream of unity was within reach, the Emperor looked upon his Thunder Warriors and saw the problem they posed. They were too unstable, too short-lived, too saturated with the sins of war. Worse, they remembered the thrones they had broken, and some perhaps began to see themselves not as servants but as inheritors. The final blow to the kings of old came not from their defeat, but from the silent purge that followed. The Thunder Warriors, victorious and broken, were hunted down, isolated, erased. They had fought kings, they had slain gods, and now their own father deemed them a threat. Whether the Emperor ordered the purge directly is debated in whispers, but the result is known. The Thunder Warriors vanished, their corpses buried in mass graves, their names scratched from history, their role in the fall of the last kings reduced to rumor and forbidden texts. But in that moment, when Terra's last sovereigns were crushed beneath thunder and flame, the Thunder Warriors stood as the ultimate symbol of transition. They were the bridge between tyranny and empire, a bridge that had to be burned the moment it was crossed. The last kings of Terra did not fall to a greater dream. They fell to men who knew nothing but the command to destroy. And so, if we ask who ruled Terra before the Emperor, we must also ask, who ended that rule? The answer is not one man, not one act of genius or charisma. It was a legion of forgotten giants, screaming and dying in the mud, tearing down the thrones of the old world so a new one could rise. One that would forget them, just as it forgot the kings they slew. In the yawning void of pre-imperial history, where memory is ash and truth is reshaped to fit the needs of empire, one theory persists like a sliver beneath the skin. that there was never a true last king because there was never a singular, visible sovereign. Instead, some believe Terra was ruled not by a tyrant, not by a warlord, but by a ghost, a shadowy regency, a technocratic council, or perhaps even a hidden cabal of psychic or machine-linked governors who held the reins of global influence long before the emperor raised his banners. This is not a theory embraced by mainstream imperial scholarship, naturally because it suggests the emperor did not emerge from chaos but supplanted an invisible hand that had long guided humanity in silence. The proponents of this idea, many of them forbidden archivists or rogue historians, call it the silent regency. They suggest that while the world's surface was fractured into kingdoms and fiefdoms, there existed an overarching structure, a web of control so deeply embedded in Terra's infrastructure that no warlord ever truly ruled alone. Not unless they were allowed to. In the remnants of the old data vaults, many now inaccessible, buried beneath the mass of the imperial palace or fused into new spheric detritus, there are hints, references to pre-unification protocols that dictated continental resource flows, orbital weapon silos that never fired, and ghost code embedded in planetary defense grids. These systems required permissions to access, permissions supposedly no longer held by any existing regime during the Age of Strife. And yet, they functioned. Cities that should have collapsed under logistical strain endured. Populations were redirected with uncanny efficiency during plagues. Entire water purification networks continued for centuries without local control. Who maintained them? Some believe it was not kings or empires but an ancient machine collective, not true AI, for such a concept had long since become a heresy, but a distributed intelligence system. A collection of surviving pre-strife overseers, perhaps tied to the lost Mechanicum, who enacted planetary continuity protocols from the depths of forgotten vaults. Others propose a psychic cabal, a conclave of early human psychers so powerful they could manipulate perception and thought at planetary scale. They didn't rule by decree, but by thought. Their existence would explain the eerie synchronicity in some of Terra's surviving arcologies, the unspoken order that seemed to persist despite the surface-level chaos. There are darker versions of the theory. Some believe the Silent Regency was a human-machine hybrid network, not AI, but biologically maintained nodes grown from cloned cerebral tissue linked to ancient cogitators. These brain banks, maintained by robotic servitors or enslaved technopriests, would have overseen the planet's functions, adjusting systems according to old parameters written during the dark age of technology. Perhaps even now, hidden beneath the Emperor's own palace, some of these systems still pulse, obeying instructions written before he ever walked Terra as a warlord. The strongest evidence cited by supporters of the hidden regency lies in the Emperor's own behavior. When he began the unification wars, he did not target the most obvious kingdoms first. He struck with precision, cutting deep into mountain vaults, seizing atmospheric control hubs, taking over data-cored cities that held no military value. It was a campaign of surgical erasure. Systems were overwritten, archives purged, subsurface complexes sealed or vaporized with technologies he alone understood. The implication is chilling. The Emperor was not merely fighting warlords. He was deleting a system, and perhaps in a twisted way he had to. A system that had endured through the Age of Strife, faceless and eternal, could not be co-opted, only destroyed. A ruler cannot tolerate a rival he cannot see, cannot kill, cannot replace. So the Emperor became the only mind that mattered. The machine gods were made myth. The vaults were sanctified or forgotten. The systems were rewritten under the Lex Imperialis. The ghost of governance was exorcised. Yet echoes persist. Deep within the black cells of the administratum, certain data adepts speak of background processes they cannot trace. Directives embedded in the fabric of Terran infrastructure, executing orders no living human authorized. Seals open to voice prints no one recognizes. Census data adjusts before it is even compiled. Servitors pause, mid-function, to perform rituals no one taught them. It is entirely possible the Silent Regency still exists, dormant, subverted, fragmented. Or perhaps, in its final moment, it passed a final instruction to allow the Emperor to ascend, because he represented not opposition, but completion. The ultimate expression of control, of unification, of singular will. Perhaps the hidden rulers saw in him the ideal they could never become. Perhaps they allowed themselves to be erased. Or perhaps they never existed at all. A fiction built by those who cannot accept that the emperor emerged alone, unaided, unopposed. But if they did exist, then the last king of Terra wore no crown, ruled no palace, and died without a name. He was a network, a ghost, a silence beneath the noise. And his passing was not marked with a scream, but with the flicker of a light turning off for the final time. There are those who whisper, quietly, always quietly, that the emperor did not begin his rise with war, but with patience. That long before the unification wars thundered across Terra, long before the first Thunder Warrior raised a blade, the master of mankind walked among humanity not as a god or warlord, but as a shepherd in shadow. These are the heretical theories, the forbidden philosophies, which claim that the emperor's role in Terra's fate began not at the moment of his declaration, but centuries, even millennia, before. The premise is simple and terrifying in its implications. The emperor did not rise to power, he built it from the bones upward, from behind the curtain. While kingdoms clashed and empires rose and fell in the shattered age, he was already moving pieces, quietly, relentlessly, not by conquest but by manipulation, infiltration, and design. This vision of the emperor, as the hidden hand, is not one of divine inspiration, but of strategic genius so immense it borders on incomprehensible. He understood that to reshape Terra, he could not simply arrive as a new warlord among many. He had to ensure the stage was cleared before his entrance. That meant guiding the fall of rivals long before they knew they were under threat. It meant fostering conflict between warlords, feeding old rivalries, spreading subtle technologies to destabilize regimes, while planting whispers in the ears of technocrats and cult leaders. Supporters of this theory point to the strange synchronicities in the collapse of certain key power blocks. The Ivory Empress of the Antarctican Vault cities, whose domains spanned ice-sunken vaults and geothermal keeps, suddenly vanished without resistance. Her rule ended not in war, but in internal disintegration. The Skylords of the Andes, who for decades rained orbital fire upon their enemies from ancient satellite platforms, experienced system-wide failures in a single week, leaving them defenseless to Thunder Warrior assaults. The Bloomfather Spore Empire, once unassailable due to its psychic symbiosis with Terra's mutated flora, withered overnight when an engineered blight reduced his living fortresses to mulch. Too many events aligned too precisely. It was not just conquest, it was orchestration. And behind every neatly toppling domino, the silhouette of the emperor grows clearer. He had the time. He is, by his own unspoken myth, ageless. He could have walked the surface of Terra in many forms, as a scientist in the crumbling gene labs of the Pan-Pacific Fringe, as a prophet among the hive cults of Ursh, as a healer in the plague-choked streets of the Dead Zones. He could have seeded ideas, stirred doctrines, even bred bloodlines that would later become key to his rise. Some speculate that the earliest forms of the Astartes gene seed were already in experimental form during the Age of Strife, hidden away until the time was right. That the Emperor's laboratories did not begin at unification. They were simply revealed then. More chilling still is the suggestion that he allowed certain tyrants to rise. That Caligan, the most infamous of the last kings, may have been permitted, even indirectly nurtured, so that his reign could justify the brutality of unification. Caligan's atrocities gave the Emperor moral clarity. He was not merely a conqueror, he became the Redeemer, the bringer of light. But without Caligan, there would have been no Ursh to unify against, no black sun to cast the Emperor's golden light into relief. If the Emperor manipulated even this, if he played God with history itself, then his power exceeds that of any mere monarch. This version of the Emperor is not the messianic figure so often venerated. He is something colder, a god who does not intervene through miracles, but through engineering, a mind that sees centuries as steps, people as variables. And if this is true, then the question of who ruled Terra before him becomes almost irrelevant, because perhaps no one ever truly did. Perhaps he ruled all along, unseen, pulling strings through 100 proxies, until the moment came to shed the mask and step into the light. But this interpretation also invites a profound reevaluation of what rule truly means. Is sovereignty the act of wearing a crown, or the ability to decide who does? Is a king still a king if no one knows his name, but he shapes the fate of nations? The emperor, in this telling, is the ultimate pre-king, the ghost ruler who sat upon no throne, but made and unmade every other. His dominion was never declared. It was asserted, silently, through inevitability. If he truly moved in secret, then he chose the hour of his revelation with precision. He waited until Terra was exhausted, bleeding, yearning for order, and when he rose, it was not as a contender, but as the only answer. The unification wars were not a conquest, they were a culmination. The wars had already been won in silence, the rivals were already broken, the kings were already ghosts. And so when he raised his standard, the world bowed not in surrender, but in recognition. Recognition of a rule that had already begun centuries ago, in quiet steps and secret choices. The emperor did not seize Terra. He simply arrived to claim what had long been his. The victors of history not only decide what stories are told, they decide which ones are silenced. The rise of the emperor was not merely a triumph of ideology or war, it was a triumph of narrative. In claiming Terra, he did not just conquer cities and armies, he conquered memory itself. The question is not whether there was a last king before the emperor. The question is, what was done to ensure we would never know? Across Terra, in vaults beneath mountains, in databanks fused shut by techno-sorcery, and in forbidden ruins sealed with wards and execution orders, the traces remain. Erased banners, languages extinguished mid-sentence, statues defaced with the aquila where once unfamiliar sigils stood. It was not enough to kill the bodies of the old kings. Their names had to be unmade. Their legacies had to be ground into the foundations of the new order. The emperor did not merely rewrite the future, he redacted the past. This process was not haphazard. It was systematic. As his armies advanced, scribes followed behind the Thunder Warriors, armed not with weapons, but with orders of revision. The Order of Silent Ink, an early precursor to the Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus, was responsible for identifying all artifacts, records, and oral traditions associated with pre-unification sovereigns. What they could not twist into the new Imperium's narrative, they destroyed. Books were burned, memory cores magnetized to oblivion, storytellers were executed or brainwashed. The names of rival monarchs, their philosophies, their symbols, all were struck from existence with a ferocity that rivaled any battlefield slaughter. Even the unification wars themselves were edited. Early accounts spoke of dozens of powerful sovereign entities, some of which fought the emperor to a standstill. Later records would condense these into mere warlords, barbarians, or techno-heretics. Caligon, perhaps the most infamous of these rulers, survives in memory only because his defeat was too symbolically powerful to erase. But even his portrayal was stylized, transformed into a cartoonish villain, his complexity excised, his ideology forgotten. Why such relentless erasure? Because the emperor's claim to divinity, to inevitability, required it. His rule had to be portrayed not as the result of struggle, but of cosmic necessity. If Terra had possessed legitimate kings, functioning societies, or competing visions of order, then his rise would have been just another transition of power. That could not be allowed. His was not to be seen as a throne taken, but a destiny fulfilled. This cultural annihilation extended to art, architecture, language, and even memory itself. Massive monuments were built not just to honor the emperor, but to replace what came before. The imperial palace, a continent-sized mausoleum, was constructed atop the bones of thousands of pre-imperial sites. Not coincidentally, deliberately. It buried the past physically, symbolically, and psychically. In many cases, old ruins were incorporated into the palace's foundations, turned into vaults, oubliettes, or prison cells. The past was not just forgotten, it was imprisoned. And still, echoes remain. In the subcult strata of the lower hive levels, certain rituals persist whose origins predate the imperial creed. In patterns etched into old ferrocrete walls, hidden behind newer plasteel facades, symbols sometimes emerge, glyphs that do not match any known dialect, whose symmetry suggests they were once royal emblems. These are anomalies that should not exist. But they do. In the minds of a few, perhaps no more than scattered savants and madmen, fragments survive. Some believe there are entire regions of the palace sealed not for security but because what lies within contradicts the narrative. Entire libraries too dangerous to destroy, but too revealing to release. Artifacts of the last kings, crowns, scepters, thrones, locked behind vaults so secret that even the custodes may not remember they exist. There are even rumors of a subterranean throne room, perfectly preserved, where a king's body sits embalmed, forever denied death because his very existence is a heresy too large to admit. It is in this suppression, this deliberate cultural amnesia, that the true tragedy unfolds. For we do not merely lose facts, we lose perspective. What if the last king was not a tyrant, but a philosopher? What if his rule brought peace to a quarter of Terra, and he resisted the emperor not out of madness, but out of conviction? We will never know. And perhaps that is the point. The emperor's victory was so absolute that even his enemies' names were unmade. Their ideas, their hopes, their fears, all burned away. What remains is a silence so deep it echoes. A silence that says, there was nothing before the emperor. And yet, in that silence, the lie is evident. Because if there was truly nothing, there would be no need to erase. So when we ask who the last king of Terra was, we must also ask what it means to erase a name so thoroughly. The answer is not simply historical. It is philosophical. It tells us what power truly fears. Not resistance, not rebellion, but memory. Because memory endures. Memory testifies. And sometimes, memory returns. In the darkest corners of the emperor's world-spanning dominion, beneath the layers of sanctioned scripture and authorized myth, lie the ruins. Not metaphorical ruins, but actual, physical remnants of what came before. Ancient stone thrones overgrown with moss in radiation-scorched valleys, cryptic inscriptions burned into rock that defy known languages, hollowed-out citadels sealed in reinforced alloys whose origin is lost even to the mechanicum. These are not just the leftovers of war. They are potential proof. Proof that a monarch, or perhaps many, sat upon Terra's throne long before the emperor claimed to be humanity's one true sovereign. It is easy to overlook ruins in the Imperium. The entire galaxy is a graveyard of forgotten empires. But the ruins of Terra are different. They exist in proximity to power, close enough to whisper truths that could shatter entire dogmas. Archaeotech vaults hidden beneath the Himalayan massif, ruins of pre-imperial data temples found in the Martian sea badlands, and even deeper layers beneath the imperial palace itself. All these hold fragments of a past too dangerous to name. Some inquisitors and rogue savants have made it their life's work to uncover these relics. They speak of black obelisks covered in codes that predate the High Gothic language by tens of thousands of years. Of bioreactive thrones that refuse to activate for any imperial official. Of rooms where no Vox signal functions, as if the walls themselves remember a time before the Imperium and reject its voice. One report, quickly redacted and buried, described a subterranean archive found beneath the ancient ruins of Ulaanbaatar, where murals depicted a man with eyes of fire sitting upon a golden seat, surrounded by emblems no imperial lexicon could translate. The emperor? Or another? More damning are the relics that seem to defy imperial doctrine entirely. Scepters embedded with technology unfamiliar even to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Crown-like headpieces that resonate with psychic energy, yet bear none of the emperor's symbolism. Data crystals encoded with star charts suggesting pre-Age of Strife efforts to recolonize the stars, charted not by navigators, but by a forgotten order of astro-kings. These are not random. They form a pattern, a suggestion, that Terra, in its madness, still remembered the shape of kingship, that someone, perhaps many, had once tried to unify it, or at least rule it with purpose. The most controversial evidence, however, comes not from objects, but from flesh. There are whispers, heretical, always heretical, of preserved bodies found entombed in void-sealed chambers, humanoid but not entirely human. Bodies too ancient to carbon date, clad in robes of extinct weave patterns, bearing ceremonial regalia unknown to any modern civilization. These corpse kings, as some call them, are never officially recorded. Those who find them tend not to live long, but rumors persist. A body found deep beneath what is now Segmentum Solar Command Headquarters, perfectly preserved, flanked by guardian automata that activated upon detection, speaking a language no machine spirit would answer. Another unearthed beneath the sands of the Gobi Expanse bore a crown fused to its skull and a neural port too advanced to classify. And then there are the psychic impressions. Untutored psychers, when brought near some of these ruins, have been known to convulse, scream, or speak in voices not their own. They described thrones made of light, courtrooms where reality bends, and memories that are not theirs, of council chambers debating humanity's survival, of emissaries from Martian enclaves arriving to negotiate unity, of wars fought not for survival, but for the shape of the human soul. Is all of this real? The Imperium would say no. It must say no. To accept the possibility of a prior ruler, a true, global sovereign of Terra before the Emperor, is to unravel the entire justification of imperial history. Because if someone else sat upon that throne first, then the Emperor's reign is not unique. It is not inevitable. It is not divine. It is political. And yet, the evidence piles up. Too scattered to be conclusive, too consistent to ignore. The ruins do not lie. They do not preach or seduce or pontificate. They simply endure. Stones do not care if they are forgotten. Thrones do not weep when they are buried. But they remain, waiting. Perhaps the last king of Terra left no name because he or she knew it would not survive. Perhaps the monuments were built not as declarations, but as warnings. Perhaps, beneath the surface of Terra, there still exists a tomb not yet opened, a crown not yet found, a record that proves the unthinkable, that the Emperor was not the first. And if that record is ever uncovered, it will not simply rewrite history. It will ignite it. Because in a galaxy ruled by dogma, the past is more dangerous than the future, and Terra's past still has secrets to tell. To speak of the last king before the Emperor is to chase a ghost buried beneath myths, war, and silence. And yet, perhaps the question is not whether such a figure existed, but why it matters if he did. Why do we care who wore the final crown before the master of mankind burned all others to ash? The answer lies not in the facts, which have long been obliterated, but in what this question reveals about humanity's soul, our need to remember, to question, to humanize the inhuman epoch in which we now live. The Imperium teaches us that history began with the Emperor, that before him there was only darkness. But human memory is older than dogma. It aches for meaning. And the story of a last king, real or not, resonates because it offers an emotional counterweight to the cold inevitability of imperial truth. It offers a vision of resistance, of humanity struggling to define itself in the face of extinction, not as an empire but as a mosaic of belief systems, cultures, and dreams. It tells us that perhaps the past was not perfect, but it was not void. To imagine the last king is to imagine someone who stood against the tide, not because he could win, but because he believed his world was worth defending. A man or woman who looked into the eye of a god and said, "Not yet." Someone who may have ruled a kingdom of sorrows, who may have made mistakes, even atrocities, but who did so not in the name of galactic conquest, but out of conviction. Even if doomed, that conviction carries meaning. In a universe where everything is consumed by scale, where billions die every day in unnoticed wars, the last king matters because he was singular. He matters because he was personal. His story, even lost, is human in a way the Emperor's story no longer is. The Emperor is myth, machine, symbol. The last king was flesh, perhaps flawed, perhaps noble, but real. He represents the fragility of human sovereignty before the dawn of an era in which men became mechanisms and history became script. We are not supposed to remember him. That is the point. The Imperium depends upon forgetting. To remember is to compare, and to compare is to question. Was the Emperor's vision the only one? Were there other paths not taken, other unities, other dreams buried in the soil of a forgotten world? There is a haunting beauty in that possibility. That maybe, just maybe, Terra once had kings who sang different songs. That culture, art, law, and even mercy may have once flowed from different thrones. That perhaps the Emperor did not merely rescue humanity from chaos, but replaced one dream with another. His own, total, absolute, and unquestionable. And that is why the last king matters. Because to ask who he was is to reclaim the right to imagine alternatives. To resist the prison of inevitability. To remember that history was not a straight line carved by divine will, but a battlefield of ideas, some of which are still buried beneath the dust, waiting to be unearthed. In the silence between cathedral bells, in the wind that whistles through forgotten ruins, in the eyes of those few who still dare to read forbidden texts, the last king lives. Not as a name, not as a title, but as a question. And questions in the Imperium are the most dangerous relics of all. There is a throne beneath the Golden Throne, not in stone or structure, but in essence. The conceptual seat that once held the weight of human sovereignty before the Emperor burned all crowns and declared his will eternal. That hidden throne, invisible yet monumental, is the true subject of our quest. The last place of power before the current one. The throne that held the hopes of humanity before it was reforged into a shrine. What did it look like, that throne? Was it a seat of bone and metal in a cyclopean fortress surrounded by storms? Was it a throne of circuits and logic in a hidden data vault, ruled by algorithms that mimicked kingship? Was it a literal chair, gilded and towering, upon which a man once sat and dreamed of uniting Terra not through fire, but through alliance, trade, belief? Or was it no throne at all, but a metaphor? A final idea of sovereignty held collectively by those who resisted until the very end. The truth is, the Emperor did not simply overthrow rulers. He overthrew the very idea of alternate rule. The last king, whoever he was, did not merely lose a war. He was overwritten, obliterated, replaced so completely that we now question whether he ever existed. And that is the genius and the tragedy of the Emperor's dominion. He did not just inherit the world, he reprogrammed its soul. But in that soul, echoes remain. The throne before the throne may have held a tyrant. Or it may have held a philosopher king who ruled with restraint, who tried to restore sanity to a world gone mad, who was killed not because he failed, but because he was inconvenient. Some heretical texts even whisper of negotiations, that the last king offered to join the Emperor, to bind their visions in shared stewardship, only to be refused, because there could be only one. And what does it mean that this figure, erased, unnamed, unwept, still draws our fascination? It means we are still human. That beneath the layers of indoctrination, beneath the mechanicus dogmas and ecclesiarchal fire, something in us remembers the possibility of different outcomes. Of kings not made by divinity, but by necessity. Of rule rooted not in celestial decree, but in human choice. The throne before the throne was not simply lost, it was sacrificed. Its ashes are in every cog of the administratum, in every servo skull that mindlessly records without remembering. Its ghost walks beside every soldier who fights without knowing why. It lingers in the hollow eyes of the Astra Militarum who die for a world that cannot name its own past. And it speaks in silence to all who dare to look back and ask, was there another way? This is not blasphemy. This is mourning. Mourning for the forgotten kings, the destroyed dynasties, the slain cultures, and the erased dreams. Mourning for the possibility that the Emperor, great though he is, may not have been humanity's only hope, only answer, only future. But now his rule is absolute. The Golden Throne hums with the agony of millennia. His body endures, not as a ruler but as a conduit. And we, the Imperium, live in the light of that fire, a fire that consumes all history but its own. Yet the ashes remain, and in those ashes perhaps lies a crown, tarnished, shattered, and buried, but not entirely lost. A relic not of rebellion, but of memory. A symbol that before the God Emperor there were still men, and one of them, whoever he was, wherever he came from, was the last to sit upon Terra's true throne. Before we close this exploration, consider what this means for you. If you've stayed with me through this forgotten journey, through ashes and ruins and broken myths, then maybe you feel the weight of that lost crown too. Maybe you're one of us who still asks questions. And if you are, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe, stay curious, because sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones the Imperium fears you'll remember.